Welcome to DCS Pathways. I'm Kevin Patton, Pathways Counselor for Dublin City Schools. Choosing courses and planning for life after high school can feel overwhelming. The ideas and resources shared here are intended to help students and families with this important.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much. If you're joining us live, I am joined today by two amazing people from the tech and computer science industries, and we're going to learn some things about, hopefully, some of the things that maybe you wanted to learn about, but obviously the big goal of these conversations is to introduce students and families to different opportunities and fields of interest that maybe you didn't know existed. So I'm really excited to be joined today by Jason Gilmore and Steven Popovich. Jason and I got to know each other this year because our sons are on a soccer team together, and Steve and I go way back because he was a former student of mine who we were just talking before this. He's about to hit his 10-year high school reunion this year. So he's an official adult at this point who's had lots of career experience to share on a platform like this. So I will point out there's a chat feature on here. If there's at any point a question you'd like to have asked, and by the time we get to the end and we have some time left, we'll be sure to check that and address those. But without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Jason to introduce himself.
Thank you, Kevin. My name is Jason Gilmore, and I am a partner at a private equity firm called Xenon Partners. And what we do is we, on behalf of investors, we acquire and operate businesses. And these are specifically SaaS or software as a service businesses. And I guess more specifically than that, they are SaaS businesses which build tools that other software developers use. So over the course of the past few years, we've acquired companies such as UXPin, AppSembler, Treehouse, which is an online coding school, and more recently, Adalo, which is a mobile app builder. So we acquire these companies and operate them as best we can. And what I find very fun about this particular job is the opportunity to learn both about technology, of course, but also about business as well. I'll hand it over to Steven to introduce himself next.
Yeah, hi. I'm Steven Popovich. Like Kevin said, I'm a 2015 grad of Dublin Kaufman. Grew up in Dublin and Columbus. I live in Chicago now, and I currently work for GitHub, who's owned by Microsoft. I primarily work on the Android app there, so mostly writing stuff in Kotlin, but I dabble in the back end too. So yeah, very specifically, I'm an engineer. I write software 90% of my day, and yeah, that's what I went to school for. I went to Ohio State for computer science, got my bachelor's there, and yeah, I guess that's it.
That's great. And I'm curious, I've found with technology especially, a lot of people find a love of that early on. Is where you are today, both of you, kind of where you thought you would be as high school students? Were you pretty drawn to that tech industry early, or and even if so, how's kind of shifted gears a little bit maybe to what you're doing to what you thought you'd be doing back then?
I can go. I've been fascinated with computers my entire life. I come from what I would suppose is a not technical family historically. However, I think when I was 8 or possibly 9 years old, my grandfather put a Commodore 64, which is a computer, under the Christmas tree. I smile because that shows you how old I am. A Commodore 64 was a very popular computer in the 1980s. And anyway, that was put under the Christmas tree, and I became just enamored with it and learned how to program on it. I learned how to program in a programming language called BASIC, learned how to write little text-based games with it, and obviously played a lot of games as well, which incidentally came on floppy disks, which were about that big. And I mean, that was really the beginning of it all. This was, of course, pre-internet. I was logging in, however, to pre-internet, I'll call them sites. They were called bulletin board systems, and downloading early tutorials about programming, about other topics as well. I wound up going to Ohio State and graduating with a computer science degree. I had briefly entertained law, specifically becoming potentially an intellectual property attorney, even did a pre-law program. However, I mean, honestly, the computers and the programming side of things kept drawing me in, and here we are many years later. I've spent my entire career as largely a software developer, and then more recently, I guess, a technology executive.
That's so interesting. We were born very different times, but I basically, the first software program I ever really wrote was on my TI-84, is the calculators, which I think is still programmed in BASIC if I'm not mistaken. So the first thing I wrote was a text-based game in BASIC in study hall in middle school. I remember trying to do that, and then the teachers definitely needed to lock my calculator because I also could write software that could solve like quite a bit of the math problems that we had. So that needed lockdown. But yeah, for me that was part of it. I also remember like playing around with Python a lot. For like, I don't even know why. I don't even remember what I did. Just I had it. I had probably another text-based game that I wrote just for fun. I remember showing my dad, and probably didn't even work that well, but it was something. And I've always been into video games and stuff like that. I've played many video games, which I think continues to like poise the interest a little bit, because you're like, how did they make this? And now that I'm a full-time software developer, I have an enormous amount of respect for game developers, because it's quite difficult.
I'm going to break every rule and turn my head away from the screen here for a moment. I actually still have the book that I learned from so many years ago. This is the book that came with the Commodore, and I keep it on my bookshelf here in my office, and just to, I guess, occasionally remind myself of where it all began so many years ago. So anyway, there's a computing artifact for you from the good old days.
The museums would love to have that.
Yeah, I think so.
Steven, do you still have your TI-84 or 85?
I definitely do. It's in the other room, and I used to use it like frequently for just doing quick little math, but now I just use my phone. It ran out of batteries, and then it probably is in storage, but I definitely do have
That's funny.
No, I love it. And I think, the more I've done this, the more I meet people in various industries. There are some that it's very common that people found it much later, whether they had no idea going into college or they just kind of met somebody and stumbled into a field. But technology just seems to be one that kids know pretty early if they're drawn to it. And I think just paying attention to that, paying attention to those things that you find joy from, that maybe some of your family members or your friends might not be as into, but pay attention to those things, because then all of a sudden, if you foster that and you realize that the world needs people who like to tinker and like to write code and like to develop things that, even if they're just fun or not necessarily adding a ton of value right now, because later that could turn into something that's totally different because you have that skill set. So I think it's neat to hear those origin stories from those who have been successful in the field such as yours. So I love that you share those stories. So Jason, I want to move on to some questions I've got prepared here for you. So one of the common themes I have from these interviews is just how rarely it is that career pathways are linear. So even though you knew you're going the way of technology, what have been some of the biggest shifts in your career that you maybe didn't see coming until the opportunities presented themselves?
I think two really stand out. One came very early in my career, and another relatively recently. In fact, the second I don't think I've ever discussed on a public interview, so maybe today will be the first. The first came about, I guess it was the end of my senior year at Ohio State. I had been writing programming tutorials and publishing them online on a website that may or may not still be around called devshed.com. And Devshed was like a programming community website, one of the very early ones. And I was publishing programming tutorials about a programming language called PHP and about a database called MySQL. I was doing this for fun, and they were paying me I guess a small amount of money. I think it was $100 an article, but for a college kid, that was great. And I really enjoyed writing, I found, and I thought this was a lot of fun. And I published maybe a dozen tutorials on the site by that point in time. And anyway, I was a few months away from graduating. I don't remember exactly how far away, but I received an email out of the blue from a guy named Gary Cornell. And Gary Cornell was the founder of a new book publisher called A-Press. And Gary asked me, he says, found your programming tutorials online. Would you be interested in writing a book? And I was just I remember just being blown away by this email, like, a book, like me. Like, who in the world thinks I am capable of writing a book? And I, very recklessly and stupidly said, of course I am. I'm interested in writing a book. And I pretty much dropped everything, and except graduating, of course, and wrote a book. It was called A Programmer's Introduction to PHP 4. And that published in 2001, if I'm not mistaken. And one book turned into two, turned into three, turned into, I think I've written 9 programming textbooks over the last 20 years, including one, unbelievably, I guess, for me, is still in print 20 years later. It's called Beginning PHP in MySQL, and it's in its 5th edition. And I would suppose is one of the best-selling programming books of all time, relatively speaking. And so that was one that really sticks out. Gary and I still, of course, know each other to this day. A-Press has grown to become a major book publisher. They were acquired by Springer Verlag back in 07 or 08, if memory serves. I wound up serving as the open source editor there for a while, an acquisitions editor, and never in a million years thought I would do that. Did that for a few years. So that really stands out. And I think there's a common theme between the first story and the one I'm about to tell, and I'll get to that common theme in a moment. The second that stands out happened about 6 years ago, and as I mentioned, I don't think I've ever really talked about this publicly. I was invited to do something called due diligence on an acquisition. And what due diligence is you're basically gauging the quality, technical due diligence specifically, you're gauging the quality of the technology that is potentially going to be acquired to make sure that the seller is being accurate in terms of how they're portraying this technology to be. And then 2, you're gauging risk. You're trying to figure out whether there are security issues or performance issues, things like that, that could affect the buyer's ability to subsequently run this business should they acquire it. So I received an email out of the blue, and it was a gentleman named Jonathan Siegel. And Jonathan said, hey, I hear, by way of one of your books, by the way, to tie these 2 stories together, that you are proficient in a particular technology. And I'm looking at buying in a business that involves this technology. Would you be interested in doing the due diligence? And I was extremely happy working on the project that I had been working on at the time. It was a robocall blocking service called Nomo Robo, which became one of the, I think maybe even the largest robocall blocking services in the United States. I was very happy there. We were doing great work. And I said, due diligence, I've never even heard of this. And I said to Jonathan, I said, can I do this at night? I said, because I'm busy during the day. And he was like, yeah. So I embarked upon what I thought was going to be a 10-day project, 10-night project. And I did the due diligence, and I loved the product. It was a company, it was a product associated with a company called Dream Factory. And I was like blown away by this, and did some more work on behalf of Xenon Partners, where I am 6 years later today. And things kind of felt like they slowed down a little bit. I was still working at Nomo Robo. And here comes, I guess, the crux of the story. I received an email from Jonathan one day, and he said, hey, I'm going to be up in New York. Are you going to be up there? Right? And it was like 10 days away, 10, maybe 14 days away. Well, I wasn't going to be in New York. I'm in Columbus, Ohio. And I said, as a matter of fact, I am. And I bought an airplane ticket, and I flew up there, and I met Jonathan that day, and he had a couple other meetings, and we caught up and spent the day. We didn't really talk business, just hung out. And at the end of that day, I was offered the CTO job at Dream Factory, and I subsequently spent 3 years there. Those are the 2, I guess, unexpected occurrences in my career that really stand out. And I guess the lesson that I could maybe impart regarding both of these events in my life is, if somebody opens the door for you, walk through that door. Don't think too much about what could or could not be. Consider this as a very unexpected opportunity that may or may not change things, and walk through that door. And I think most of the time that will serve you pretty well in life.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's great that our students hear as many of these stories as possible, because it really stems from the knowledge you built in areas of interest. And then because you were interested in something so much and then developed some writing skills, it turned into somebody noticing, hey, you are a good enough writer. And more importantly, you really understand something that needs to be written about. So now you've written this series of books over 20 years now. And then people who pay attention to those and recognize you as somebody who really knows what they're talking about seek you out for an opportunity that was not on your radar. So I think that's what life's all about. To your, I love that. When the door opens, step through it. You don't have to take the option that's presented, but at least take it into account and know
Yes.
that, it might be an opportunity to totally change your world. So I think that's really cool that you've had opportunities like that over, a 20-year career. So Steven, I've got a question I want to throw out there for you next. So feel very fortunate that I got to know you as a high school student. And again, I think, I've kind of talked about how a lot of times people interested in tech, you can see that passion early on. And one of my favorite things about my students who have been interested in that world is they tend to focus more on things they care about and digging into things that they're curious about learning way more than they worry about things like having the top GPA or competing against others in ways that I think too many people get caught up in the game of playing. So I feel like your example of writing the codes into your calculators just because you were interested in it and you thought that it was fun. And then of course it developed into just having a skill now that a lot of people don't have because they didn't even think to try something like that. I'd love for you to talk about some of the early projects that captured your curiosity in tech, maybe in addition to what you've already shared, and how did they set you up for future success?
So for me, I think it's probably still around in Dublin is First Robotics. First Robotics was kind of a major landmark for me because I was already writing a bit of code, but it was always like just for fun, or like for a while I got interested in music production, which was software-ish, wasn't really programming, but you could kind of program in it. But it wasn't until I joined robotics and there was a real challenge and like frankly a bit of a target and a bit of a goal and a bit of a pressure from the team to actually go and like build something that works. That's when I saw like my skills flourish, and I really got to like work on something I cared about for the first time. It felt like writing a game is fun. I remember not just programming a game on my calculator, I was programming a game in a game engine called Unity. I did all that stuff, but it wasn't until First Robotics where I really felt like, oh, this is something I'm like really interested in and like something I can see apply into real life. And yeah, I was able to like actually learn how to program a robot and see things work well and actually work for everyone. So yeah, that was one of the big things. And I was like, I don't know, none of my friends were really doing it. And it was still something I was interested in and still ran with. Yeah, I think it's very important to just do what you want to do. And yeah, as you said, I did not care about my GPA at all. I graduated. I got into Ohio State. I barely graduated Ohio State. I graduated with a 3.2, which was the bare minimum. But I came out of that with so many skills in programming because I did things like First Robotics. I did things like play with game engines and stuff like that. So I actually knew how to program when the time came.
No, I think it's great. And I think especially in the technology industry, even today, more so than when you two were growing up, there's even more opportunities for people who do a more non-traditional path in education. You always have to find ways to educate yourself to develop the skills that we're talking about, but it doesn't have to be through a traditional 4-year college program. And we're never here. I am never going to discourage someone from going through college. It's a great experience. It's a great way to grow up. It's a great way to network and just explore areas of interest. But if you know what you're interested in and you know what kind of projects you want to dig into, and you recognize that, hey, I know that these big name employers are looking for people who can do this, and I can do that here without spending $60,000 a year or $30,000 a year, or whatever it is, depending on your in-state or out-of-state. So I think, obviously you were a better student, I think, than you're giving yourself credit for, but you were maybe with some people who cared more about it or found it to just come a little more naturally to them, and that's fine. But you didn't stray away from making sure that you continue to dig into the things that you really cared about and that you weren't being graded on. You just were seeing if it was working or not. And then you were able to keep going back and trying new things if it wasn't working. And then all of a sudden you have those big aha moments and those like huge feelings of just elation when you figure something out that was really hard, but it wasn't because you were trying to impress a professor. It was just because you were interested in it. So I think those are the types of cool things that students who love technology and really digging into the way the world is evolving in regards to technology and different ways to apply it to problem solving it's amazing. So I love that you share that background, and obviously you're with an amazing employer now at GitHub, and it's really because of that approach to learning, because you just wanted to learn those things.
Yeah. I think to like kind of just expand on it a little bit. Like I got my first job out of Ohio State because I tried to do a startup with some sports web platform. I took it to a baseball conference in Ohio. I met another tech company there and they hired me. I did an excellent job and I knew how to program there, and my friend left and went to Microsoft, went to GitHub, and then they recommended me at GitHub. So like I got here on luck, not because of my GPA, but I also was ready for the lucky opportunities that were there because I had been so interested in programming that I was already had it as a skill. And I was like ahead of people in that particular skill.
No, that makes so much sense. And I know, there were times in college where you probably felt frustrated when you were in a certain class that was really difficult for you. But then all of a sudden, you were working on an outside project with a group of other like-minded people, but who they didn't have the experience that you did in building things and actually writing the code and doing the work. And that's where you thrived. And honestly, the world is going to value that skill set more than somebody who got an A in a math class that isn't relative to the work that they're doing once they graduate. So I think it's neat
Yeah.
that you got to experience your success in those ways that obviously have landed you where you are today.
Yeah, I don't want to disparage college. I think it taught me the big thing that college taught me was how to do something I don't want to do, which is an extremely important skill. I barely use the actual technical skills from college every day. I'm sure Jason could say the same thing, but it taught me how to do things I don't want to do, and eventually you figure out how to do the things you don't want to do and pass that class. But that's not the important part, is passing the class to me. It's just like, can you do the things that apply in the real world, I guess. There's many classes I didn't like. The ones I had fun were the actual programming classes, like group programming classes and stuff like that.
No, that makes sense. No, that's great. Well, one of the things I mentioned a little bit ago is just how quickly the world is changing in terms of technology. We've all heard of AI and this cognitive AI that's really kind of in all the headlines right now. So Jason, I'm curious, with artificial intelligence changing the way we live and all of these people having fears around how technology jobs are going to be replaced potentially by AI agents or whatever it might be, what are your current thoughts and feelings related to that notion that's out there?
So throughout the course of my career, and I guess in the years leading up to it, I would say there have been three watershed moments in terms of major technology shifts. One was the rise of the modern internet, coinciding really with the launch of Netscape in the mid-90s. Second was the launch of the iPhone in 2007, which made the internet largely mobile, right? Everybody certainly listening to this interview probably has a phone quite close to them in their vicinity. And then third, unquestionably, has been what is going on with regards to AI and notably large language models, beginning with OpenAI's ChatGPT launch back, I think, in October of 22, if memory serves correctly. Of the three, I mean, the internet was a pretty big deal. iPhone was a pretty big deal. I don't think there's any question that what's happening right now is the biggest deal of the three. All three obviously impacted society well beyond, the commercial sector and business and so forth. However, what's going on right now with AI seems to be particularly profound in terms of the transformations that we're already seeing. Now, I can really only speak, I guess, with some knowledge on the technology side of things. And in that regards, the coding tools, the coding AI tools, one of which is coincidentally GitHub Copilot, that are being worked on and released are just unbelievably impressive products. Some people deride them as being fancy autocomplete mechanisms. They are quite clearly far more than that. And some people consider these to be a threat. to future programming jobs, and others like me consider them to be an extraordinary productivity tool that are going to help developers build more ambitious applications even faster. I can speak anecdotally here. In the course of the last year, I've launched 3 different businesses based on AI tools, one of which is Email Reputation API, which is a tool that tells SaaS businesses whether an email that's being used for a subscription or a trial or to purchase a product is in fact valid, meaning it's not a bot or an anonymous remailer address and so forth. And another one more recently is, coming full circle, a technical due diligence tool that is used to make the due diligence process more productive. Both of those tools were written by leaning heavily on these AI coding tools, both GitHub Copilot, a tool inside ChatGPT called Grimoire, and then more recently, there's a new coding environment out there called Cursor, which is almost like voodoo magic. It works so well, right? So I think what's interesting about what's going on with these AI tools and maybe the future of programming technology positions is, on the one hand, are they in a very real sense reducing the amount of hands on the keyboard work that programmers have to do? I think the answer is unquestionably yes, and it's only going to get better as time goes on. On the other hand, if the programmers are not hands on the keyboard using this as the tool for translating what's in my head into something that's showing up in the browser or the mobile interface, well, what does that free me to do? It gives me more time to talk to users, to think about what other types of features I might incorporate into these applications. It gives me more time to work on maybe the infrastructure or the performance, like things that AI can't yet do. And I think in the end I know in the end makes me a far more productive contributor to whatever it is that I'm contributing to. So I wouldn't necessarily think of these tools as necessarily threats, but in fact, quite the opposite. They are always on, 24/7, 365 coding assistants that can help you turn, or your colleagues turn, what is in your head into a product that others might want to use. I'll also note in closing that there's a certain irony that we're seeing across our 12 companies at Xenon Partners right now, which is the influx of AI marketing tools, coding assistants, and so forth, actually seems to be making one-on-one human-to-human interactions that much more valuable. So we've been going to conferences a lot lately. I've spent a lot of time this year down in DC at Department of Defense Artificial Intelligence conferences. And we're, again, rather ironically, finding meeting people in person to be a far more efficient use of time than trying to get on the phone with somebody or trying to get into LinkedIn or get on a Zoom call or what have you, right? So if you're somebody who likes to talk to people, if you're somebody who likes to socialize, I would think that career in tech is actually, the opportunities are brighter than they've ever been before, because in the future, there's clearly going to be this very highly automated side of tech, and then there's going to be the human side of tech, right? And I think that's pretty interesting.
No, it's very interesting. It'll be interesting to see how it might shift the types of students we see becoming interested in these opportunities. And obviously, it will also be good for students who maybe are a little more introverted to recognize the importance of some of these skills. It doesn't mean you have to become an extrovert, but it means you have to be able to put yourself in more opportunities to practice socializing, to be a stronger communicator. And if you need those times to go and recharge because that's not what's natural to you, that's fine. But I do think it's important to recognize the importance of being able to have those types of conversations face to face, and to not just, those jobs where you just kind of sit behind a computer and code all day on your own might not be there in the future, but it doesn't mean there's not going to be great opportunities in tech in the future. So I think that's a very interesting concept. So Stephen, obviously you work for an organization that's creating some of these tools that are making it easier for people to do some of the things that used to take much longer. And now we have these open AI, open source platforms to kind of use as a way to be way more productive and efficient with our time. So if I'm a high school student and I love the idea of learning more about this and developing these types of skills that are in demand in your field, what are things I can be doing right now to help myself set up for future success in job prospects?
Yeah, I don't think the tech jobs are going away. I totally echo what Jason said there. They're not going away. There's so much work to be done, and there's so much value to provide in the tech space, and AI is just going to be a tool. I actually think that like AI will it will delete people doing boring things like just I need to spin up like a web server. That used to be arduous, and now an AI can do it in like 2 minutes, and then it can give you all of the code. What's really interesting about that specific task is like spinning up a web server is like a college task or maybe even like a high school task that can now be solved by AI. AI can also explain it to you. So I think something that I've done is like very recently I had to write analytics for my app, let's say. It was a new language to me. I didn't know the language. I spent a ton of time in ChatGPT actually asking, how do I do this in XYZ language? How can I spin this up? And it's largely correct. And it like really, really, really speeds up my ability to learn new things and to onboard onto new languages and new like programming patterns. So for me, I think, yeah, if you're not, as I always say, you should have some sort of project you should be working on. And now I say you should be using AI to learn about whatever you're working on, whatever programming language it is, whatever problem you're trying to solve. If you're trying to make like a real-time chat app, like ChatGPT can do a lot of that for you and it will tell you how to do it. And I think that's probably the most important thing I would be thinking about, to be honest.
No, that's great.
And sorry, just to quickly jump back in, like per what Stephen just said about being able to ask ChatGPT to like create maybe the skeleton or the framework of something that you have in mind. I will argue till I'm blue in the face that this is not the job of a programmer, right? It's not putting your fingers on the keyboard and typing is not the job, right? The job is turning a business plan, a business idea, a product idea into reality. And this keyboard is just the tool, the very inefficient tool that translates what you have in your head into what winds up executing on the computer. And if you have, again, I almost feel like this is ironically, if you have a very solid grounding in computer science and a very clear understanding of the technical pieces that are, and when I say that about very clear understanding, I'm talking about the actual terminology being used, the concepts and so forth. You can actually make the AI generate the code used for one of these applications much more accurately do so, right? So at least at present, if you don't have some understanding of how programming languages or frameworks or databases work, you're going to only be able to explain that in a very fuzzy sense, right? And it's almost like if you're learning a different language, like I'm bilingual English and Italian, right? But I'm learning Japanese. And if there's something I want to say in Japanese, I'm trying to like the gears are turning, right? And I'm just trying, it's on the tip of my tongue and I can't quite say it. Well, that applies to programming languages as well, right? Like, that there's this thing, the programming language can do, but because you don't have the knowledge built up, you can't say the thing that you want to say. Well, because large language models have trained on an enormous body of software applications, it's by reviewing the code and making all of the connections necessary to understand how all of that works, the more accurately you can convey your idea in English language terms to the LLM, to the AI, the more accurately it can subsequently generate the code, right? So what I'm getting at here ultimately is it's as important as ever to understand the fundamental underpinnings of how software works, because in doing so, you're going to be able to make the AI work more efficiently for you.
No, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I know AI is can be very useful. It's can be an incredible assistant, but you have to know how to write the correct prompts. You have to know how to your
Yes.
point, have that foundational knowledge to know how to ask the right questions or to get it to do exactly what you're trying to get it to do. So, certainly we have great opportunities in Dublin City Schools for students to get that foundational knowledge through classrooms. So we have Intro to Computer Programming, we have multiple AP Computer Science courses, AP Computer Science Principles, and then Steven talked about the robotics club that he was a part of. Great way to just go and really apply that knowledge. And even if you have very little knowledge to start with, you're going to surround yourself with people who will teach you the basics. And then you can just start doing the work alongside people who do understand it a little bit more. And then you're going to learn from them. And all of a sudden you start to wrap your head around concepts because you're living it. You're forcing yourself to try these new things that you're learning about. And we just have all these great ways to expose students to that. So obviously we have those types of opportunities for students in the classroom. What are some things maybe for a student who's doing that but wants more, or is looking for opportunities to, whether it's no cost or low cost ways to go out and practice some of these things that we're talking about?
I think the easiest ways to go and do it, like, game engines are free to try. Every programming development environment you can think of is free. You can download them. I would say everyone watching this has access to a computer and the internet. That's all you need to actually get started in technology. And for me, I found as a person who liked video games, for me, the most interesting thing was to learn the basics of a game engine and to like actually get into it. I didn't need other people. I didn't need to join a club. There's massive advantages to join a club. And again, I would suggest like doing something like robotics or like some sort of programming club. And the social aspect is massive too. But if you really don't have anything else to do, like try and make a game, a 2D side scrolling game. Like literally my college project in my third year was like remaking a Mario, the 2D side scrolling game from the 90s, I guess, making that from scratch in a modern game engine, which it was a difficult project, but like you learn the absolute fundamentals and you have to, otherwise it will not work. So I think that's it. Now, if it was these days, now I'd have ChatGPT open on my window next to me, asking it questions the whole time, generating code that probably doesn't 100% work, and then I can massage it to get it closer. And then between our two brains, I'm going to have something working. And along the way, I'm actually learning the concepts of how to program and like how to fix a compiler error and how to load an image or whatever. Yeah, I think that's the most important thing that you should be doing.
I agree with everything Steven said. I'll also note, plug for Steven's employer, GitHub. GitHub is a social coding website where you can publish your code for everybody else to see. This is, I think, critical to mention because there's nothing like showing your work. And if you are interested in programming, if you're interested in the career in technology, when you're sitting in an interview or you're applying for a job in programming or in technical sales or in DevOps or infrastructure, you name it, if you can point to some prior work that you've done, even if it's entirely unrelated to the job that you're applying for, right? Like such as a game that you've created, you can point to your GitHub account and say, yeah, hey, I wrote this 3D scrolling game, check it out, right? Or better, I mentioned the coding school Treehouse. I ran that, was the CEO there for just over 2 years, and I talked to hundreds of students, if not thousands, during that period. And this question about interviewing came up all the time because they were afraid. It's called imposter syndrome. They were afraid that they weren't good enough, right, to apply for this job. And what I always try to drive home to on them is not only the point about GitHub, but also don't just show your work, run your work, meaning deploy your work, put it on a free hosting website such as netlify.com, and actually be able to pull that up on your phone during an interview. So if somebody says, oh, hey, Kevin, could you tell me about your JavaScript experience, right? If I've built, even if it's just for fun, if I've built a game in JavaScript, I can have something to draw upon in my response. I might not have had a previous job as a JavaScript developer, but if somebody were to ask me that question and I've built a JavaScript driven game, I could say, oh, I'm glad you asked that question. Because I've spent the last few months building this JavaScript driven side scroller game called called Super Kevin.io, and it runs around and gathers coins, and it made 5 levels, and it's really neat. Let me show it to you. Let me show it to you on my phone. And you can turn it into a show and tell session in that interview to underscore the fact that you do, in fact, know what you're doing. Do you have a college degree? Maybe. I don't know. I've never really cared, right? Not saying college is important. I'm just saying if you can show me that you're interested in this programming language or technology to the point that you've actually taken it upon yourself to build something with it, whether it works or not, that's not the point.
Yeah.
Then you're going to put yourself in I think, a pretty good position. And as Steven said, all of these programming languages, all of these databases, they don't cost anything these days, which is pretty cool.
No, it's so cool. And I feel like my number one thing I try to create as like the priority you should put at the top of your list when deciding what to do beyond high school, whether that's college, whether that's doing something else related to what your interests are, what is going to be the area where you can gain the most experience, work with people who can put you in positions to do things that you'll need to know how to do in a work setting. Because all of the things that you just described, like showing up with an example of the work you've already done and being able to share that, is so much more important than being a really good student or being able to speak to, hypotheticals of what you would do. And it's, you put yourself in a really tough spot to get hired if you don't have things to show for yourself. And if you're willing to just do entry level stuff, especially even just projects like we've been talking about that you just enjoy, that you didn't get paid to do, but now you have skills that you can be paid for, you are ahead of the people who just have taken a few classes. So I think these are the things I want our students to be recognizing, and don't wait until after high school. Start in high school. Start building now. Start networking now. Start meeting people like you two who are on this podcast, who are sitting here because you want kids to understand these things. And now all of a sudden they have someone they could reach out to on LinkedIn or over email and say, hey, I really enjoyed what I heard. Like, here's a project I'm doing. Is there something that you would recommend that I do to further enhance these skills? And I just think I wish more kids would do things like that. But even if I get 5 more kids to do it, their futures are going to be so much brighter because of it. And that's what we're trying to accomplish here. So I really just appreciate both of you spending this time with me this afternoon. I know anybody who tunes in and gets a chance to hear what you had to say is going to really benefit. And I know we have a lot of kids interested in technology and really embracing the skill sets that we're describing in this interview. So just can't thank you enough. As we're kind of getting close to wrapping up, is there anything you want to share that maybe we haven't touched on, or any final words that you think would have been nice to know when you were a high school student, if someone had shared with you before we wrap up?
I can go. The one that really stands out is people are often not the experts that you think they are. And I think that's important to always keep in mind, because this technology is so new and it's changing so quickly that if you're kind of surveying the employment landscape, the technology landscape, it's easy to say, wow, I could never be there. I could never work there. Those people, they're too smart. They've done this too much. The reality is it's just not true. It's not true. Companies are always looking for bright-minded individuals who are interested in doing a job, interested in showing up to a job, interested in doing a good job. And if you have prepared for that position by, again, publishing code on GitHub and launching little side projects for fun, I think you're going to put yourself in a far better position than you realize when it comes time to interview for that role. So, but the critical part here is you got to put yourself out there, right? You got to do the work in order for people to realize that you're capable of doing the work. You can't just tell me you can do the work, because, not sure I'm going to believe you. But if you show me the code, if you show me the app, as somebody who's hired a lot of people over the years, I'm much more willing to take a chance on you if you do that.
Your resume is going to stand out like that, I feel like, to be honest. I feel like it's almost harder, not harder, but like, for some reason it seems that people find it harder to go and build something on their own than it is to just go and get like a good GPA. Like, if you want your resume to stand out, like, be able to talk about something technically in depth is like a really big deal. Like, the reason I got hired at my first job was because I was able to talk about like how I was thinking about scaling my web app if it ever got users, which, by the way, the first web app I created got literally 0 users and we failed and we gave up. That still launched me into Microsoft 3 years later. So it doesn't matter if you fail. It doesn't matter if what you make is good. The game that I spent an entire summer making a game. I really didn't go outside as much as I should have. And I look back on it, it was not even kind of fun at all. But I learned an enormous amount and I could talk about what I did. And that's what stood out to employers and in interviews. In interviews, I could actually, I famously, the first job that I had, they had a really hard interview question. And I was the only one that ever answered it correctly as an intern. And that's why I got the internship there. And it was just there was a question you weren't supposed to answer. And I got it just because I had thought about it a lot. And it put me ahead. And it was because I built a side project where I actually had to solve real problems. So yeah, I think that's what I would take away. High school is not that big of a deal. It seems like the whole world to you. You'll forget about high school in 5 years. I'm 10 years out now. I barely remember anything from high school. Just have fun and do what you want to do. Dive into what you're interested in. That's what I would say. If you're an expert in anything, you can get paid to do it, to be honest, these days.
Yes.
Technology or not. But if you're an expert in something, you'll get paid for it eventually.
I love it. Well, you guys have shared so many amazing things during this interview, and really appreciate just your willingness to be here. And I know that as I continue to meet with students and learn about all the things they can be doing, I'll reflect on conversations like this, and I know I have a great network of people that I can direct them to if they have specific questions that I know are beyond what I'm capable of helping with. So thank you for what you're doing, and really appreciate your time this afternoon.
Thanks for listening. Please do not hesitate to reach out with any questions about the many resources we have in Dublin City Schools related to exploring post-secondary options. My email address is patton_kevin@dublinschools.net. I also want to give special thanks to student intern Cam Williams from the DCS Media Marketing Academy. Cam designed the cover art for the show and will be sharing regular updates via social media. Be sure to follow Cam's posts at DCS Pathways Pod on Instagram and TikTok. Hope to see you next week.